Aesthetics are something that almost anyone will struggle with when first starting with the Create mod, so this video aims to teach you how to make your builds more compact and more aesthetic. Of course, before we can get into how to actually do it, we need to understand how to move rotational force, because that is what is going to compact your machines, right? Your machines are powered by rotational force, and the trick is always getting rotational force where you want it to go. And there are three types of ways, or 3.5 types of ways to move rotational force. You have your cogs, you have your mover blocks, and you have your machines, which are broken down into two categories. Your cogs are pretty simple. It's your large cog wheels and your small cog wheels, and there are a few things to actually talk about, even though these guys are decently simple. Starting with our friend the small cog wheel. Small cog wheels are pretty great because they can move power in a line like this. They can't move power diagonally, however you can split them like this, right? But it all has to be in a straight line. They can move power upwards like so, but at that point you'd want to use a shaft, and they can't change their power from vertical to horizontal. There's no way for a little cogwheel to shift its power with just little cogwheels. That differs with the big cogwheels, who can't connect power in a line or diagonally. They actually can't connect power any way from them. However, they can shift their power like so. See how this big cogwheel is powering this big cogwheel, and I even have this little phantom thing that I can continue to move the power of the cogwheel, vertical to horizontal, vertical to horizontal. Now, as you can see, big cogwheels and little cogwheels can move power diagonally, but there is a consideration to make, because this is called a gear shift or a gear ratio. I'm going to be using the term gear ratio because it's what I prefer. So what's happening here is the little cogwheel is receiving the rotational force and transferring it to these large cogwheels. The little cogwheel spins at 32 RPM, but the big cogwheels spin at 16 RPM. That's because in a gear ratio, if the small cogwheel receives the rotational force and transfers it to a large one, it will half the rotational force. Similarly, if our large cogwheel receives the rotational force, which you can see is 16, the small cogwheel gets doubled to 32. Now, these are very useful if you want to increase the speed of your machines or slow the speed of your machines, but if you don't want that, then definitely don't use this to do diagonal rotational force transfer. Horizontal diagonal force transition is really easy without cogs, but unfortunately, this is the only way to do a vertical facing diagonal force transfer, and we'll get into that more. Another consideration to make with cogs is that each time you connect a cog to another one, it will invert the rotational force. So you see this cog is spinning to the left. If I were to connect a cog here, you can see the cog spins to the left, where this spins to the right, and so on and so forth. So keep that in mind as well. That could either be very helpful, or of course it could be very detrimental depending on what you're connecting. So here are our mover blocks. These are blocks that are specifically meant to move or manipulate rotational force in some way. This isn't all of them. There are others that can do this, but these are the most important. You have your shafts, your belts, your encased chain drives, your adjustable chain gear shifts, your gearboxes, and gear shifts. Shafts are the easiest of them all. They just move power in a straight line, either horizontally, or they can move power vertically. They can't change the direction of power or anything like that, but of course these are very useful. Belts are sort of the butter of shafts, if shaft were the bread, because a belt is placed onto a shaft, and not only are these guys great at moving items, but for the purposes of rotational force, they move rotational force. You see, this belt is being, the input is here, the output is there. You can use belts to extend them, or if you grab yourself a wrench, you can use wrenches to unextend them, I suppose. They're super useful, because there's very little limit to how long. I think the limit's like 32 or something. But yeah, see, if you were to put in rotational force, the exact same rotational force will come out on this end. So right-facing rotational force outputs right-facing rotational force. It can even do that upward, so you can take horizontal force and transfer it vertically. You can even take a vertical force and transfer that horizontally. However, what's really cool is you can take a horizontal diagonal force and transfer it diagonally, but this does not work vertically. Unfortunately, there is no way to do a vertical diagonal, which is what I was talking about with the cogs. Now, this gear shift is more minor, but all it does is invert the rotational output, which is very useful. It's not, I put it in the mover blocks because it's more of a mover than anything else, but this is all it really does, which is extremely helpful for when you need it. That being said, your good friend the gearbox does the same exact thing, sort of. Not only does a gearbox allow you to split one direction of horizontal force into the other three, but it does rotate on the opposite ends, you can see. So as you can see, this right-facing rotational force is mirrored on the left side and reflected on the output and the right side. So you can see, I'll just give a little bit of an overview for you guys to understand how the rotational force is split through a horizontal gearbox. There is, of course, as well a vertical gearbox that can take a rotational force into it horizontally or into it vertically and split it. You can actually see when it splits upwards, it does split in the same direction. These are both right facing. Now on the output side, of course, that is going to be left facing, and then on the bottom as well, it would have been left facing too. Now, obviously, the main use for a horizontal gearbox is to give yourself a 90-degree split. However, it's also very useful if you want to have two belt systems on opposite sides of one another going in opposite directions, which could be helpful for some contraptions that require loops, because this belt will be moving in a different direction than this belt. If I were to grab ourselves a creative motor, I could, of course, demonstrate that. Look at that. They both power each other and move in opposite directions, which is super helpful. And then, of course, the vertical gearbox is very much meant to take a horizontal rotation and turn it vertically, or a vertical rotation and turn it horizontally. It can also be used in the exact same way to power belts on either side of it and just have a vertical rotation go through it too. The encased chain drive, you can see, is a way to almost mimic what the belts can do, but in block form, right? It takes a horizontal power and delivers it horizontally. You can even do it vertically. You see how they're all connected like this? The rotation that enters any one of these blocks will be transferred to all of them. So that is super helpful. But they have more features than just that, right? They're not just reskinned belts. Oh, and they also, of course, can do the vertical thing too. But as I was saying, these are not just reskinned belts, because with two of these guys, you can actually turn the horizontal or vertical of rotation, right? This is a horizontal being turned into a vertical rotational force. Oh, and by the way, don't stack them up like this. They don't connect vertically. Just use shafts. But that is extremely, extremely helpful. Now, as you can see, it can't take a vertical force and convert it into a horizontal. That's because, like I said, they don't connect vertically. But this is one of the big things that can really help in compacting a machine. It does change the rotational direction. This is a right-facing, which turns into a left-facing direction. So they're like gearboxes, but they can extend over many blocks. You can even use an adjustable chain gear shift to control the speed of the output. If an adjustable chain gear shift is receiving the speed and is unpowered, nothing happens, right? An unpowered one doesn't do anything. You need yourself some redstone power. If it receives it, you can see it doubles the speed of everything that comes after it. However, if it is the last in chain, or rather, I think if it's just not the one receiving it, right? If it's not the one receiving it and you give it some power, it will slow itself down. Now, not the other ones, but you can see this has an 8 RPM, where this has a 16 RPM. So that is also super useful. You can arbitrarily slow things and speed things up. So moving on to machines, because machines, some of them can transfer power. There are two categories. There are cog machines and shaft machines. And of course, the cog machines are powered by cogs and can give off a cog's output in every direction. And a shaft machine is one that takes in a shaft input and then outputs that rotational force. You can see all these are powered from the back, but they also output their things. And the cog machines are going to be your mechanical mixers, your millstones, and mechanical pumps. Your shaft machines are presses, crushing wheels, pistons, rotation speed controllers, pulleys, deployers, and weighted ejectors. There are probably more, but these are just the ones that I placed down to show you. Now, with the cog machines, the same rules apply, right? You can power cog machines with other cog machines as long as they are in a straight line, because all cog machines count as a small cog, not a big cog, a small cog. That does mean all the rules of gear ratioing also apply to small machines. You can see you can ratio down with a machine and you can ratio up with a machine, which is very helpful for a mechanical mixer with like a water wheel. You can power it through a large cogwheel and cause it to double. So keep that in mind. That's very helpful. And then if you want a super secret tip, guess what? The millstone, boom, it has a shaft output or input on the bottom. So you could actually power the thing from a cog or from a shaft. So that one's really cool. In fact, just to show it off right now, because I think it's so neat, you can use a vertical gearbox and some belts to create a really, really, really simple system for powering a belt as well as a millstone. And then you could of course use a funnel for the output. So if you wanted like a really easy way to have items kind of coming in and then coming out, and then of course here we go, like this, and then this, boom. Look at that. We're already applying a bunch of our ideas, and this should actually be an output one. But we give this guy the appropriate power, and look at that. That one's a spinning. These guys are spinning. Items that I want to crush go here, and then the crushed items come out. So there is just a small example of how you can use these machines and your knowledge of them to make something smaller. This is a looped crushing setup where the input and the output are on the same level as each other, right? You don't have to run around for anything like that. And it takes up a super small amount of space. In fact, the smallest space that belts can take up is 2 blocks. So there you go. In a 3x2 area, you have yourself a perfect milling setup. Alright, but I'm getting ahead of myself. There's more to talk about. Shaft machines are very simple. They have a shaft output. They don't obviously have a whole bunch of nuance as compared to the cog machines, but do remember anything that does take a shaft input will work with these, so you can use them with gearboxes, and of course you can chain them together, which is super, super useful. In fact, if you take yourself some deployers and think about using deployers for a precision mechanism where you have to use 3 of them at once, right? If you place them in the right way, where they have the shaft facing outwards, you can have your whole line of deployers powered by something hidden in a wall instead of having the power to be visible. So if you have, you know, you would have your belts here, and then, I don't know, potentially a barrel here where your gold input would go, or even like a chest here, and on the back of it you have a funnel, right? And then you don't even have to see anything from gears or shafts. Alright, now let's talk about keeping things pretty, right? Because we now know how to move around rotational power in some interesting ways, but let's talk about how to make that pretty. With shafts, cogs, and casings, because guess what? You can right-click brass and andesite casings onto shafts and onto cogs. You can even use a wrench. Shift right-click to pop it off. And there we go. We can now show off how that looks. Of course, the small cog wheels also go, and I really like how the small cog wheels look. The big cog wheels, the big cog wheels kind of stick out like that, but still it gives them more of a block. It makes them look a lot more integrated into something. So, not too bad. Mostly this is used for if you have like exposed shafts or, you know, shafts in a wall. You can keep them nice and pretty, make them look a lot more structurally sound. Another thing is, here's a block I never see used, brackets. Yeah, you can use brackets, metal and wooden brackets, if you want to keep your shafts exposed, but make it look like they're more supported. These are both, super cool, although apparently very difficult to pick up. I thought you'd be able to, okay. I suppose they're a little annoying to pick up, but the brackets are super duper cool. Another thing to think of is block pallets, right? And of course, the create block pallet is kind of the create block pallet. But my point here is less of what you build around with, but what you build a machine out of. One thing to consider is if you need to do this with belts or this with encased chain drives and you don't know which one to pick, right? If you just need to move something horizontally, think about whether the machine would look better with an encased chain drive or with a belt. Potentially it would look better with a belt, or it would look better with an encased chain drive. Take this machine for instance. We have belts here, a gearbox here to make them move opposite, and a press. So this is a compacting, an auto-compacting setup. There are a few different ways that we can power the mechanical press. One thing we're going to want to do is to keep the form of this thing as tight as possible. We're going to want to use this power to get to this power. Now, this is a very belt-heavy design, so maybe you might think that it would look better to use a belt here instead of using the bulkier gear shifts, right? Because if we use the gear shifts, it does introduce kind of a new element to this thing, right? Personally, I would say, because this uses a lot of belts, that it does look better to use a belt here. Or, to keep its form factor even smaller, you can use a belt here. But I always think that blocks off kind of one side of it. unless of course it's meant to be used like this. It's up to you whether you want to be able to see the machines or not, right? And of course, remember, a lot of things can be hidden in the walls. One thing I may have forgotten to mention is that you could also decorate belts. Belts can have a little bit more oomph to them, like so, and even the vertical facing belts can be given more of a substance, so they can fit into walls a little bit better. They're definitely going to show up as belts, and you're going to want to have something behind them, of course. But you can see this belt certainly looks better and more in line with a brass kind of block palette. And on that note, don't be afraid to stuff stuff behind walls or even underneath the ground. Sometimes you just can't make something look pretty above the ground, so you got to use it underground. That is where vertical gearboxes and chain drives become super helpful to bring that underground rotation to an overground rotation. Another thing this machine does really well is power itself, right? Anywhere where you were to input power into this thing, the machine would move. This gearbox powers these guys and this guy at the same time. And one thing that's really cool is you could actually do that very easily with crushing wheels on a belt setup. This is one of my favorite tricks. Say you've got yourself your belt line and you want to have some crushing wheels on it, because crushing wheels, the items don't just have to be dropped inside of it, they actually will work on belts. But of course, the ways that you might know how to power them are to use gearboxes on the top or cogs on the bottom. Well, lo and behold, really helpfully, you can right click a shaft into a belt line, and this setup here with the vertical gearboxes underneath them will put both of the crushing wheels rotating opposite to each other and in the correct direction. So, if I were to power the system, you can see the wheels are crushing this way, and the belt is moving that way. And of course, if I were to invert the signal, they move in the correct way. So this is a super easy way to guarantee your crushing wheels are going to be moving opposite and in the right direction. A really nice use case of encased chain drives is actually with the rotation speed controller, because the output rotation of a speed controller is 1 higher than the input rotation. So this is a really good spot to use your chain drives, especially if you want to input rotation from this side and output it on this side. These guys are going to help with that a lot. This is especially helpful for these 2 block gaps. Otherwise, what you would have to do is use a vertical gearbox here and a vertical gearbox here. That uses 8 of your precious cogs and exposes a lot more shafts. They also don't connect very well. But with these guys, they have this really nice kind of connecting texture that they seem really fluid, and they expose less shafts. So obviously a lot of aesthetics come down to personal preference and of course the blocks you use to build your area. But you can use these machines, the casings, and the different methods I've taught you today to make your machine smaller or at least more aesthetic looking, right? To get that kind of look and feel that you want. And I really hope that this did help. If it did help, let me know. If it didn't help, let me know as well. And if you want to see more like machine tutorials or other tutorials like this where I just kind of go over concepts and work through them with you, and it's less of me just talking at you and more of a, you know, like, hey, check this out, you know, and hey, check this out. Like conversational tutorials, let me know, subscribe, watch my series on YouTube. Let's thank the sponsors. I just want to use this time to say thank you so much to the members of this channel. They are helping this channel and me become closer and closer to becoming a full-time content creator. So if that's something you'd be interested in, subscribe and become a member.